Bullies cut. The new girl's hair in class. What happened next shocked everyone. Emily Walker was no stranger to being the new kid. As the daughter of a military officer, she had moved from town to town, school to school, all her life. She had learned to adapt quickly, but Ridgewood High was different. This was not just another school. It was a school filled with cliques, long-standing rivalries, and an overwhelming sense of pride in its social structure. Emily wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew one thing for sure. It wouldn't be easy. From the moment she stepped through the front doors of Ridgewood High, she felt the weight of every eye on her. Whispers followed her through the hallway as she tried to make her way to her locker. Her brown hair fell over her shoulders, her uniform fitting her slender frame just right. But it wasn't enough to hide the fact that she was an outsider. No matter how hard she tried, it felt as if she was walking into a space that didn't want her there. She was used to the looks, the raised eyebrows, the side glances. She had been through this before, but Ridgewood felt different. People here were not subtle. They made it clear with their body language and whispers that she didn't belong. It wasn't just that she was the new kid. It was the way they saw her, as someone who didn't fit into their little world. Emily was a quiet girl, not shy, but certainly not one to speak up or make waves. She preferred to keep her head down, to focus on her studies, and to avoid unnecessary attention. But on her first day, she couldn't escape it. As she passed groups of students, she could feel the disapproving glances, the judgment in the air. By the time lunch rolled around, Emily found a small, quiet table near the window. She didn't expect to be joined by anyone. She was fine with her solitude. She needed time to think, to adjust. But it wasn't long before the whispers started again. This time, they were coming from across the cafeteria, from a group of boys who were sitting with their lunch trays. Their laughter echoed across the room, and though Emily didn't hear every word, she knew they were talking about her. She did her best to ignore it. After all, it was nothing new. But then one of the boys, Jason, looked over at her. He seemed to notice that she was sitting alone, and for reasons Emily couldn't quite explain, he locked eyes with her. The smirk on his face was unmistakable. Jason was one of the most popular boys at Ridgewood. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a sharp, confident demeanor that everyone around him seemed to admire. He was the type of person who had a way of making you feel small, just by looking at you. Emily had seen him before in the halls, surrounded by a group of friends. He had that arrogant confidence that made him feel untouchable. But she wasn't scared, not at first. She had learned to ignore people like him, to let their comments and judgments slide off her. But as Jason stood up from his seat and started walking toward her, Emily's heart began to race. The whispers in the cafeteria grew louder, and she could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her once again. Jason stopped in front of her table and leaned down, a smug smile spreading across his face. "You sitting by yourself?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Emily looked up at him, her expression calm but guarded. She had no intention of getting involved in whatever game he was playing. "I'm fine," she said simply, not wanting to engage. She just wanted to eat her lunch in peace. Jason didn't take the hint. Instead, he chuckled. "You know, it's kind of sad. You're sitting here all alone. What's wrong? Did nobody want to sit with the new girl?" Emily's stomach tightened. She could feel the weight of his words, but she wasn't going to let him get to her. She ignored him, turning her attention back to her lunch, hoping he would just walk away. But Jason wasn't done. He stood there, blocking her view, his eyes scanning her face, as if waiting for her to react. "I guess it's not surprising. People like you don't usually fit in here. You should probably just go back to wherever you came from," he said with a smirk. The words stung, but Emily didn't flinch. She had dealt with people like him before, but something was different this time. As she looked up at him, her anger started to rise. She wasn't going to let him treat her like this. She wasn't going to be anyone's target, not anymore. The next day, the atmosphere at Ridgewood High was tense. Jason, still feeling the need to assert his dominance, had made it his mission to bring Emily down a few notches. He couldn't stand the idea of someone like her existing in his school without knowing her place. He, along with his friends, Matt and Ryan, began to formulate a plan. They knew Emily was quiet, not one to make a scene. That made her the perfect target. If they could push her hard enough, they were sure she would either cry or back off. Either way, they would win. Jason made the first move during lunch, walking over to where Emily was sitting. This time he had a different look in his eyes, less casual, more purposeful. He wasn't just teasing her anymore. He was trying to break her down. "You're still sitting alone, huh?" Jason said, standing over her once again. His friends, Matt and Ryan, hovered nearby, waiting for the fun to begin. Emily looked up, meeting his gaze. She could feel the tension in the air, but she didn't let it show. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Jason grinned. "Just wondering how long you were going to keep sitting here, looking all sad and pathetic. You should be grateful we even let you sit here at all," he said, his voice full of mockery. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but she wasn't going to give in. She wasn't going to let him see how much his words affected her. Instead, she stared back at him, unflinching. Jason leaned in closer, almost daring her to react. "You know, I don't think you belong here. You're just not the kind of person who fits in. You don't even belong in this school." That was the final straw. Emily stood up, her hands clenched at her sides. She wasn't going to let him walk all over her any longer. She wasn't going to let him break her. Without a word, she shoved Jason back, hard. The entire cafeteria fell silent. Jason staggered back, surprised by the force of her push. Matt and Ryan exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected Emily to cower, to give in, but this was different. The tables had just turned. Emily stood tall, her chest rising and falling as her heart pounded in her chest. She had never been one to cause a scene, but something about Jason's behavior, his mocking tone, and his bullying crossed a line she couldn't ignore. She had taken enough, and in that moment she realized something vital. She didn't need to accept this treatment anymore. Jason was recovering, slowly rising to his feet, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger. He wiped his hands on his jeans, trying to salvage whatever was left of his pride. "You're crazy," he spat, glaring at Emily as if she had done something completely unforgivable. "Crazy?" Emily's voice was calm, but there was strength in it that surprised even her. She wasn't shouting or trembling. "No, Jason, I'm not crazy. I'm done with your bullying. You don't get to treat me like I'm nothing." A murmur spread through the cafeteria, whispers growing louder as other students began to realize that Emily was no longer the timid girl they had assumed her to be. Jason had made a grave mistake in underestimating her. Jason's usual response would have been to escalate the situation, throwing more insults, maybe shoving her back. But there was something different now. He hesitated, looking at Emily with a mixture of confusion and frustration. She had stood up to him, and it made him uncomfortable. The power he once held, built on intimidation and fear, was slipping away from him. Ryan and Matt, his two friends who always stood by him in situations like this, exchanged glances. They weren't sure what to do either. This wasn't the easy victory they had expected. Jason's reputation had always been built on making others feel small, but now the tables had turned. He had been knocked off his pedestal, and the crowd was watching, waiting to see if he would retaliate. Jason's jaw clenched, but he didn't move. He wasn't sure how to respond to Emily's calm demeanor. He had expected her to crumble, to apologize, to beg for mercy, but she didn't. Instead, she was standing taller, more composed than he had ever seen her. After a long pause, he finally spoke, but his voice was quieter now, lacking the arrogance he had earlier. You think you can just push me around? Just because you shoved me back doesn't mean you won." Emily shook her head, her eyes never leaving his. "I don't need to win, Jason. You don't have power over me anymore." She turned her back on him then, walking away from the cafeteria, her heart racing but her posture straight. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt free, unburdened by the need to please anyone, to fit into anyone's expectations. She had stood up for herself, and that was all that mattered. Behind her, the cafeteria was still abuzz with conversation, but it was different now. The whispers were no longer about her weakness or her inability to defend herself. They were about her strength. The girl who had been pushed around for so long had finally pushed back, and she had done it with grace. Jason sat there, staring at the spot where Emily had stood moments ago, feeling a mix of confusion and humiliation. He wasn't used to being ignored, let alone having someone stand up to him in front of an entire room full of people. The whole experience had shaken him more than he was willing to admit. For years, Jason had relied on his reputation as the tough guy, the one who could make anyone feel small, the one who could control the social atmosphere of the school. He had built his image on fear and power, and it had always worked, until now. Jason glanced around the cafeteria, seeing the faces of his friends, but they weren't looking at him with admiration or the usual sense of superiority. Instead, they were watching him with pity or confusion, unsure of how to react to what had just happened. Ryan and Matt, who had always been his sidekicks, were silent, their usual bravado missing. The energy in the room had shifted, and Jason couldn't help but feel it. "Dude, what the hell just happened?" Ryan asked quietly, his voice uncertain. Jason didn't answer right away. He wanted to be angry, to lash out, to somehow regain control of the situation, but the words weren't coming. He looked down at his lunch tray, trying to focus on something, anything that would bring back his usual swagger. But it wasn't working. Jason realized with a sinking feeling that the power he once had over the school was slipping away. He wasn't the feared bully anymore. He wasn't even sure if he was respected. In that moment, he realized that all his actions, his insults, his bullying, they had only made him weak. He had never learned the true strength that came with self-respect, with treating others as equals. Matt leaned in, his voice low. "Man, you can't just let her get away with that, right?" Jason turned to him, his face hardening. "I don't know what happened," he muttered, his tone filled with frustration. "I've never seen her like that." Ryan, still unsure of what to make of the whole situation, spoke up. "You've got to do something, man. You can't let her just walk away like that. She humiliated you." Jason's eyes flickered with the old arrogance, but this time it wasn't as strong as before. "Yeah, I'll deal with it, but not right now, not today." As the rest of the lunch period continued, Jason sat there, his mind racing. He knew what he had to do. He needed to show everyone that he still had power, that he wasn't weak, but deep down he knew that the real lesson had already been taught. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Emily hadn't just beaten him physically. She had beaten him mentally. And in that realization, Jason began to understand the one thing that had always eluded him. True strength wasn't about making others feel small. True strength was about lifting others up. The following days at Ridgewood High felt different. Jason, once the undisputed ruler of his social circle, walked through the halls with a newfound sense of uncertainty. His usual swagger had been replaced with a more contemplative, almost self-conscious demeanor. The reactions of his peers, the whispers, the awkward glances, they all weighed on him. It wasn't the fear or respect he was used to receiving. This time it was something else. Pity, confusion, and maybe even a little disdain. In the aftermath of the cafeteria incident, Jason had expected Emily to cower, to apologize for standing up to him, but she didn't. She had simply walked away, unshaken and stronger than ever, and as much as Jason hated to admit it, her calmness in the face of his aggression had rattled him in a way he couldn't explain. The once confident bully was now unsure of his place in the school. His reputation had been irrevocably damaged, and it was a reality that he couldn't ignore. What had always worked for him, his dominance, his ability to make others feel small, had backfired, and now he was the one feeling small. One day, as he walked down the hallway, he saw Emily again. She was sitting alone in the courtyard, her nose buried in a book, looking peaceful and serene. Jason hesitated. He had never thought much about how she felt, but now he realized that she was different from the other people he'd bullied. There was something about her that he couldn't quite put his finger on. She had strength, but it wasn't the type he was used to seeing. It wasn't loud or in your face. It was quiet, like an undercurrent that ran deep. As Jason walked past her, something unexpected happened. He stopped. He turned around and walked back to where Emily sat, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what he was doing, but it felt like he needed to say something, to acknowledge something that had been bothering him. "Hey," he said, his voice awkward, "can we talk?" Emily looked up from her book, surprised but not startled. She nodded, closing the pages slowly. "Sure." Jason took a deep breath. He wasn't sure where to start, but the words came out anyway. I just wanted to apologize for what happened. The whole thing in the cafeteria." Emily raised an eyebrow. She had expected some form of apology, but not the sincerity behind it. "I'm listening," she said. Jason shifted uncomfortably. "I was a jerk. I've been a jerk for a long time, but I didn't realize how much damage I was doing. I thought I had everything figured out, that I could control people, that I could make them feel small and be the one in charge. But that's not real power. It's not strength." He paused, as if trying to put his thoughts into words that would make sense. "You showed me that." Emily watched him for a moment, her gaze steady and unwavering. "And what does that mean for you now?" Jason sighed, his shoulders slumping as if a weight had been lifted. "It means I've been wrong. I don't want to be that person anymore. I don't want to be the guy who tears others down to make himself feel better." The air between them was still, as if waiting for something. Emily looked at him, her expression softening. "It takes a lot to admit that," she said quietly. Jason nodded. "Yeah, but I owe you an apology, and I know words don't mean much after what I did, but I'm going to try to change. I want to be better." Emily gave him a small, appreciative nod. "That's all anyone can ask for. Just make sure your actions match your words." Jason stood there for a moment, feeling the gravity of the conversation. He had expected her to brush him off or tell him to leave. Instead, she had listened. And in a way, that listening had given him the first real sense of respect he had ever received. As the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, Jason turned to leave. But before he could walk away, he stopped. "Thanks for not letting me get away with it." Emily gave him a small, knowing smile. "We all need someone to remind us who we really are, even you." Jason walked away, a weight lifted off his shoulders, but a new understanding settling in. The old him, the one who thrived on bullying and controlling others, was gone. It had taken a moment of humiliation, a moment of vulnerability, and an unexpected conversation. But Jason had found something much more valuable than power. He had found respect, not just from others, but for himself. As the days passed, Jason began to change. He didn't seek to control anyone anymore. He didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than any insult or show of power ever could. And slowly, the students at Ridgewood High began to see him differently, not as a bully, but as someone who had learned a hard lesson and was making an effort to be better. For Emily, the experience had been eye-opening as well. She had proven to herself and to the school that strength came from within. It wasn't about being loud or dominant, it was about standing firm in your truth, showing kindness when it was hardest, and knowing that real power wasn't in making others feel small, it was in lifting them up. And as the school year went on, The quiet girl who had once been an easy target became someone to be admired, not just for her strength, but for the wisdom she had shared with the people around her, Jason included.